Well, I guess we're just going to start here. My name's Cliff. I run the WebBot project, also known as the WebBot project, but I run halfpasthuman.com. I've had a number of requests for a Wujo, which is discussion about woo-woo subjects, subjects usually disregarded, overlooked, or officially denied or ignored by the powers that be or authority or the establishment. Anyway, so this little Wujo is about, as you can see from the board behind me, it's a very shaky Wujo, which is applicable in many different ways, but it's about the little bloop theory of reality here. Rather than the Big Bang. So this is like a serious ultimate alternative concept. Let's get into it here real quick and give you just a fundamental understanding that the Big Bang is basically an outgrowth of religion, and it comes from the idea that my God is bigger than your God. And as a result, my God blew everything into existence from a non-existent place. And we're all in that existence that he, the Big Bang promulgator, created. Now, there's a whole lot of flaws and fallacies and misunderstandings and bad assumptions, all of which underlie the Big Bang theory. Now, and it's totally false. A universe does not exist that way. And they keep having to make up constants and fudge factors in order to keep the Big Bang theory operational. So the more they go along, the more the academic scientists, assuming that Big Bang theory is correct, try and shove everything in there. Any new information that they find, they figure out some way to make it fit in. So they come up with string theory, noetic cell theory, all different kinds of weird stuff, just to make this sort of thing able to support the Big Bang theory and keep academia going as such. The last is my editorial comment. I don't know why they do it. They're locked into a mindset. Their minds don't grasp that it doesn't make any sense on the face of it, and they should examine a new paradigm. However, for whatever reason, everybody promulgates it. You know, they're tenured, they have investment in the whole concept and idea, and so they keep going with the idea. Now, the little bloop theory here is just we're gonna try and step through this as rapidly as possible. We have got a major flying shitstorm happening at everybody here in Half Past Human, from Igor, the guy who does manages my little server garden. It's much too small to be a farm, all the way over to myself and the vegetables that help me with the boats, and Kathy and the dogs and everything. Just been one of those kinds of times, and that's actually what we're here to discuss, is time, because this is where the neuron meets the Matterium, and we have to get into the reality of reality. And if you look at certain things from the perspective of academia, you get blinded, you keep following their steps one after the other, and the next thing you know, you're 30 years into an understanding that is quite false. In my case, I'm 62 years into it, but my understanding is not as false as those currently blinded by academia. So we'll go into some of the quick little understandings of what the little bloop theory is and what it entails. I actually have a script for this little Wujo, something entirely different. So little bloop theory starts off with the idea that there was no Big Bang. There was actually an initial little bloop, and that's how reality started. And that's where the universe comes from. In the Big Bang theory, they postulate that all this energy existed and it blew itself into reality and keeps expanding forever and ever and ever, because it was such a huge amount of energy that was all constrained in a single little tiny point, infinitesimal point. It got pissed at that, and so it burst out like a self-shattering egg, and continues to fill universe. And universe continues to expand for that reason. Absolute bullshit. Universe continues to expand because it's continually filling up with little bloops. Now, so I'm going to turn here and shift around, and there will be some disconcerting movements within the video cam because I can't get it to not react to these changes. However, I need to do some drawing to illustrate what's going on. And so we'll go right up here next to where that little bloop part is. And I'll attempt to keep the sound as coherent as I can as I go along and herd the dogs around with my knees so that they don't represent too much of a trouble. All right, now this is what universe started as, okay? Universe started as a energetic pulse, a bit of energy. Even the Big Bang guys admit that. And in my case, the energy was probably infinitesimal. But it was more energy than had existed before, and so it was probably on the order of, let's just say, a fractional part of a milliwatt, and or a milliamp, I'm sorry, and maybe a fractional part of a volt. It doesn't really matter. But what it was a little pulse. It wasn't any kind of a giant blow up into creation of universe. What it was a pulse that came in and of itself, and it pulsed through the entire known universe at that point, and in the process of doing so, it came back upon itself. And that's what this little drawing up here starts to represent, and I'll enlarge that as we go along. Now, the pulse, when it went through all of universe, went out at the rate of 22 trillion times a second. That's a whole huge amount of speed. This thing is just blindingly damn fast. This pulse. It still exists. The pulse continues to this day. In the Big Bang Theory, they say it happened once and then everything else existed since then as a result of that once, but the onceness is ceased, other than this continuous expansion of theoretic energy that was put into this infinitesimally small spot and blown into the existing universe. In my concept here, in the little bloop theory, what occurred was this pulse went out, it went through universe, and it crossed over itself, came back so fast because it moves outside of time. It's not bound by time or space or any of that. This pulse was there and created, in essence, all that you and I are and everything that's going on here, because it created the Matterium. Now, the Matterium is this place in which human awareness experiences time and space and itself. And so we'll call that reality. Okay, so the Matterium is what everybody else may call reality. I just want to be a little bit more definitive as to how we describe things so that we can get down and be a bit more precise about our understanding of what it is to be human and what reality really is, what it is we're messing with here. This is really cool stuff. You can, it's the fundamental understanding that underlies magic, religion, fantasy, wonder, grasp, reality, everything. So let's back up a minute because it's necessary and go all the way up to the top of our little board here and look where it says universe equals the sum of all human experience. I'll use that word repeatedly. I just wanted everybody to understand exactly what I mean by universe. And there's a huge difference between universe and Matterium. So for instance, Matterium is the perceived space that we all exist in. The place that we say here is reality. But universe is grander than reality because the universe is the sum of my experience and all humans who have come before me, all humans who will ever come after me. In this long, giant chain, we all add to universe with our experience, with our consciousness flowing through the Matterium. As it flows through the Matterium, it collects experience. And in its distillation of those, we add to universe, because universe could be thought of as the giant aggregated self-aware, or I don't know if it's self-aware, but it's at least conscious database of all human expression and experience. So those are really our two major definitions, because a lot of time people say universe and they're talking about the place where we experience matter, and where our minds are tricked into thinking that this dry erase board is solid. And I'll explain to you how that occurs in just a second. But I define that as the Matterium, and that is the place in which we perceive time, space, ourselves, and what we call matter, thus Matterium. So let's get back to the little bloop theory. So in the beginning, you can see that our little tiny milliamp, millivolt burst of electricity, hardly enough to sparkle, even static electricity, but all that was required, went through universe at that time, because the universe was so small in terms of human consciousness, and the Matterium was so small because there was no human consciousness to perceive it at that point, but it went through it very fast. And it still continues to go at 22 trillion times a second. That just is a calculation I made, and I can explain how I made it and why. But it goes far faster than we can perceive. And it flashes in and out of existence, this pulse, because there's a pulse and a void. So really there's something going on at a rate of 44 trillion times a second, half of it pulse, half of it void. And what's actually going on is that universe is creating itself continually. So in the Big Bang Theory, there was create once and basically erode thereafter is their metaphor, their mental construct for what universe is. In the little bloop theory here, our metaphor, our basic construct, is continuous creation, destruction. And we destroy things as we write that. Anyway, so it's all blurry and crap up there at the moment. Come on, guy, I'm down here. But it's continuous creation. Destruction is the model under which we operate mentally, because the pulse is counterbalanced with a void. You'll notice that universe, as well as universe, encompasses Matterium, and Matterium, you'll have to accept this statement, I can back it up later, is self-balancing because of its fundamental nature of this dichotomy, this duality that is expressed between void and non-void. That which isn't and that which is. If you sort of Buddhistic or Taoistic in thinking, but it's actually a real solid concept if we just translate it all over to these initial bursts of energy. Because the pulse is continuous. It comes from consciousness, as all of universe and all of Matterium are both conscious. And what it does is it continually creates new matter. And it does so by circling through universe instantaneously, 22 trillion times a second, and crashing over itself. And it creates these nexuses. And in there, it keeps crossing and 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 crossing until the energy is so dense at that point of crossing that matter is actually created at that point. Now, this is this is where the boundary line is in the statements about E equals mc squared. Well, okay, energy equals matter accelerated to the speed of light squared. But where would that occur? This is that actual spot, okay? Within all of Matterium, there are an uncounted number of these spots where all this energy crosses over itself over trillions of times a second. And in so doing becomes denser and denser and denser in an aggregated form right at that particular little nexus. When it does so, when it is pulled in and reaches a particular point that meets certain criteria, not pertinent at the moment, then a little bloop of reality is formed. And this little bloop is usually on the order, because of the nature of reality itself, formed from a negative hydrogen ion, which will make it appear here. And then, but I'm going to draw it in a particular way so that I can illustrate what comes along with this. So the nexus point creates this little bloop of reality in which we find a negative hydrogen ion. Now, this negative hydrogen ion is one of the most energetic levels of particles that exist naturally without scientists coming on in with their chisels and hammers and breaking it down into subatomic particles just because they can. So this negative hydrogen ion, though, in the little bloop here, coming out of the energetic buzz that creates all of Matterium, brings along with it two really cool things that scientists, academics, and whatnots won't really tell you about. And it brings along the S and the T factor, okay? So we're going to put these up here as an S and a T. I hope you can see those. Come on, little camera. Catch up. I'm down here. Okay, so these preceding and trailing subscripts represent space and time. And this is the real cool part of this whole kind of a talk, is that if you catch on to what's going on here, and you look at reality as it is occurring and creating itself in this continuous creation-destruction mode, you see that each and every one of the molecules that are created, each and every one of the particles that are part of that molecule down to the level of these ions, brings along with them that which is necessary for their existence within the Matterium itself. Now let's note that the things that are necessary for its existence within the Matterium are space and time. So here's a real shocker for you. Scientists won't acknowledge it, but there's nothing, absolutely nothing, between the molecules that compose your cells. That is to say, there is no space between those molecules. Space does not exist absent the molecule that it's housed within. And the same is true of time. Time does not exist independent of the molecules, of the particulates that we perceive of in the Matterium. So there is no time absent these intersections of this energy blooping into reality. Now there's a bunch of other corollaries that go along with this. The continuous creation-destruction model, we're continually creating these little bloops. We're creating them in untold numbers now. And in fact, it is the nature of this understanding of reality, of the Matterium, that the further we advance in aggregation of time components from these individual bloops, the faster reality will create more of the little bloops. And thus reality, Matterium, universe, however the academic tends to define it, will have a tendency over time to grow faster and faster and faster and larger and larger and larger because of its previous size. So it's basically one of these things where if we were to look at the formation of universe over time, we could look at it this way on one of those little kind of charts where we have size of universe versus the time it took to create it. So we have size, not space, but size, or space. You could probably think of it that way. And here's the time. And then when universe started off, it was one little bloop, and then there'd be two, and then exponentially more and more and more, and more and more and more, and more and more and more, more and more and more. And each, if we were to track this across time, we would discover that each, and if we could separate it this way, and every one of these individual layers was in fact as large as the layer before it plus some factor. Not a fudge factor, not continuous. It's going to vary wherever you are in universe. It's not going to be ubiquitous. It can't be ubiquitously applied. But in general, the theory is true that each and every one of these layers here is the sum of the layer before it, the previous layer, and a unknown amount of increase. And so in growing, this particular little tiny formula here meets all of the requirements that this big, long, tediously boring, needlessly redundant formula on the expansion of the universe that the Big Bang requires. I mean, you wouldn't believe that thing. I was looking through some physics books and I was just appalled. There was the page after page after page after page of this formula in which they tried to justify all of the ramifications of the Big Bang theory and why universe continues to expand at an increasing rate instead of slowing down. It really freaks them out, and so they keep coming up with this. But what's happening is that we have the first little bloop, and in this little bloop, we're gonna destroy our drawings here in a second. Let me see if I can find it. There we go. So we get this here. Universe keeps growing. It grows bigger and bigger and bigger in a quasi-exponential factor. It's not doubling or anything like that, but it's growing at an increasing size. So size the size of the universe is going up, but the rate at which that size increase is also accelerating. And that's driving this in this curve fashion. Anyway, so what's happening is that this first little bloop, let's say that little bloop represented universe, then you can see that it's so small relatively that the bang around inside of the pulse goes so fast and so repetitious that the first bloop that came into existence probably created right after it 100 bazillion bloops. And then after that, that created a number so large I couldn't express it. And it's been that way ever since. And it simply is because of the nature of this universe and the pulse that powers it. So the pulse and pause, or void and non-void dichotomy, is really the power that everybody talks about when they talk about 0-point energy. What is that energy? Well, it's this pulse, and the pulse not electric, but you could measure it if you could get your stuff tuned to 22 trillion times a second, you could probably pick it up and measure it in an electrical fashion. Meaningful? I don't think so, but it's likely that it's doable that way. This actually represents the 0-point energy that everybody seeks, or energy from the void, energy from the vacuum. The only vacuum, by the way, that exists is behind stars. A vacuum is an artifact of within the Matterium. It doesn't exist on the other side of this pulse and non-pulse boundary. Okay, so now we can get into some of the what I find really, really cool. This is a nice little base for us to begin with, right? And so the really cool part of this, from my perspective, is we can examine space and time in a very meaningful fashion here. And we can even diagram them in a cartoon-like fashion that may make sense to everybody. And it provides some level of thinking. And academics are going to find it really hard to refute any of this because it can answer all of the questions as to why material can actually stain. According to the Big Bang Theory and their understanding of particles, you should not be able to stain material simply because there's of its connection to its own molecules. But let's continue here with our examination of space and time within the little bloops. And so we have our little bloop, and we have its space and its time component. By the way, as Matterium got more and more dense with stuff in it, the pulse keeps going faster and faster and faster and faster within it, and finding more and more and more and more connections, and thus all of Matterium seems sort of solid to us. By the way, the reason that we perceive it as we do is that our brains, or let's put it this way, our sensory apparatus, our sensory array operates at 30 to 60 frames of perception per minute. So if we're operating at 30 to 60 frames of perception per minute, then we ain't seeing 22 trillion times a second. It's just not happening, folks. So under those circumstances, it'll appear solid. We can move our energy nexuses, because, by the way, when it precipitates into the Matterium, that's an understanding in our minds. All right, it's still this nexus of energy. It never changes. It's that our mind perceives that nexus of energy as this hydrogen ion, but it's still this nexus of energy created by the pulse. There's another component of this. This pulse comes out 22 trillion times a second, and then it stops 22 trillion times a second, and everything disappears in the void. And then it recreates itself in the next 22 trillionth of a second pulse, and then it destroys itself, and it's gone. It's gone, people. It does not exist. And this allows this ability to travel outside of space and time, by the way, without violating any of the Newtonian laws or any of the absurd Einsteinian understandings. Anyway, so then it creates itself again, and you've got space and time recreated by the pulse on its next go-round, because the pulse travels where it's been over and over and over and over and over again, each and every time recreating itself. Now, this gets us down to the idea of complexity, but let's get into the understanding of what is locally effective versus universally effective here. Okay, so we can put it this way. There's two basic understandings that are part of this duality. We have this duality, pulse, pause, void, non-void. That metaphor exists at all levels. It's a design pattern. It exists at all levels within our Matterium. And so within there, we find that there's other expressions at a more complex level of this duality of pulse, pause. One of these is the idea that something can be universally effective, or let's put it this way. Sorry, let's not use that word. It is universally effective, but at the moment I don't want to reference it at that level. Let's call it this way. Let's look at it as pan-Matterium effective. Okay, so pan-Matterium. So pan-Matterium effective, or something can be locally effective. Okay, and we'll just call it LE. And this is really merely a subset of a chunk of the Matterium. And so here's actually what's going on with time and space. Time, for instance, is universally effective and is locally aggregative. So it has very little local effect. So when we get a lot of these little bloops all together, and they form the whole of the Matterium that we're in, and you got bazillions of these guys all together, what happens is that all the space parts clumped together in one way of our thinking and our perception. Bear in mind, the Matterium is the place in which we perceive time, space, and ourselves, and reality. Okay, that which we think of as matter. So we perceive all of the space components all gathering together, and so we think space is really big, gigantically big, hugely big beyond our understanding, because we can't see all of it. Well, this is because when the space molecules get together, they are locally effective. So one space component merges with another space component, and the two of those cooperate very nicely right at that level. Okay, so let me see if I can demonstrate this graphically so it'll make some kind of sense. So all of these little bloops are coming into existence 22 and destroying themselves 22 trillion times a second. And when they come into existence, all of the spaces gather together to form what we can call as our local space, or our local space environment. So you can travel, so to speak, from one molecule to another energetically, and you can cross-connect these molecules at the space component, space aspect of it. And so you slide from one to the next. If one were able to do this, you would, if your consciousness was small enough, you would be able to go from the space in one of these little bloops into the space of another one. And because locally all the little spaces are all cross-connected in this thing where each can get to any other, no matter who is where, because they're all locally effective. Time is not that way. Space is. So space is locally effective, but it's pan-Matterium aggregative. So we think of so here is space. Let me see if we'll okay, so we'll put this up here. We'll remove our little bloops and we'll start building down. So space is locally effective and is pan-Matterium aggregative. Now what that means is that these are aggregated. together to form a larger perception in our minds. So we perceive of the spaces all connected into this giant thing that we think of as universe at a colloquial level. Not universe this way, but more appropriately, it really is describing Matterium in many times when people say universe. And in this case, they're looking at basically all the space aspects of each and every one of the complexity nexuses. And so that is just one of the aspects of this intersection of these energy particulates or energy waves. And this, so they're looking at the space aspect of that all aggregated together, and that's why it's pan-Matterium aggregative. And I'll explain in a meaningful way what the difference is here, okay? So now let's look at time. Time is exactly the opposite of that. Of course, pulse and void are opposite of each other. We're going to have space and time sort of be opposite of each other as well. So time, sorry about that, is pan-Matterium effective and is locally aggregative, okay? So now what's going on is that with time, the component of time here, all of the time molecules together from all of the Matterium all joined together every pulse. Not true of space. Okay, so on the recreation part of the cycle, on the creation part, all the total sum, total of time molecules or aspects, time aspects, all of these together recreate themselves as a sum component, as a single thing. Thus we have what I call the ever-present now. All right? And that's why time is pan-Matterium effective. It's because no matter where one would go in the Matterium, you would be connected to the pulse in a sense, because it's recreating you 22 trillion times a second. But you'd be connected to all other time in the known Matterium by the now experience. You would be available, or you would experience time at the same now sense any place in Matterium as you would any other place in Matterium. Could you be in each of those in those two separate spots, which we won't get into that. If you could be in both spots at the same pulse, you would experience that now as exactly the same within yourself. And to all intents and purposes, that's really all that we can go by is our internal perceptions of all of these and how we take that on board as humans, because that contributes to this total universe, which is the sum of all human experience. So time is pan-Matterium effective. It works throughout the whole damn Matterium all at once. Space, on the other hand, isn't. You would experience space differently in these various different places because it's locally aggregated and thus is gathered together. It's locally effective, and they interact with each other and affect each other and alter our perception of that particular subset at that particular spot within the Matterium. But that's not true of time. Time feels the same no matter where you are. Okay, so the perception of time is pan-Matterium effective. So, and bear in mind, the Matterium exists only in our minds. It's only part of perception. It is the place, the presumed place, in which we perceive time, space, matter, and ourselves. So that being the case, let's acknowledge here that since it's all about perception, we need to use human feeling and a tuned precision of feeling to be able to guide us through this whole reality thing. We do it anyway, but we can do it in a much more formal basis by acknowledging that and walking into it with an open part of the protocol or part of the agenda. I'm looking at some notes here on this. Like I say, I actually made notes on this one. Okay, so I'm hoping that everybody grasped the idea here. I'm going to have to take some of this down in a second. that we go from the cross connection of all of these little nexuses, which exist only continuously as energy, recreating themselves 22 trillion times a second, and who knows how many trillions upon trillions upon trillions upon trillions of times a second in just this little talk here. And then it creates these little bloops. This is part of the pulse, pause, void, non-void, comes on down. There's duality everywhere. Perception would not exist without duality. Everything is conscious. Getting into all of that's going to be a whole nother wujo. But there's a couple of things I need to go through real quick. A couple of really quick points I want to make. Then I'll shut this down. Everybody can go back to, at that point, your perception of reality is up to you, and not in control by us. So we have space has the quality of being locally effective and locally affected by other space, whereas time isn't affected by local time. It doesn't give a shit about local time. Time exists everywhere as the same. And that's what provides this ever-present now, which is really something that's extremely important. And that's why the Buddhists and everybody are harping on it, but they miss telling you some of the cool technical components about what you can do with the now if you understand all of this. Again, another wujo that we got to get into because it takes fucking forever to get into that. That's where you hack reality by your understanding of time. So let's get rid of some of this. I'll just take us from, let me see, I don't have that much really. Let's see, lines of the pulse. Oh, okay. This also, by the way, pulse and pause, cause and effect. All of these dualities exist because of that. Okay, so do I need to take that? Yeah, I'm going to have to take down this part here just to be able to show us what's going on here. Now, a couple of quick things that don't relate to this subject per se, okay? They're interrelated, of course, because everything happens in the same Matterium and because it's all happening in the same now. However, let me I just want to point out some things here that, personal peeps, stuff that really pisses me off, simply because people just don't grasp what they're saying. AI equals theoretically artificial intelligence, okay? And this comes from this fucking Big Bang theory. The idea, people in the non-technical, non-computing world that come up with this shit are laughed at by those who understand how computers work, because it represents, and no one really understands why, or they don't discuss why this perception exists, that you can have a self-aware computer. Okay, that's really what they're talking about. You'll hear them use this idea of self-aware computers. And again, the idea is 100% bogus, can't happen. And it represents the concept, an epitome of a concept, that the number of neurons equals consciousness and awareness and self. Bullshit. Sorry, guys, bullshit. The number of firing neurons, neurons does not equal consciousness. It doesn't equal self. Any of that, okay? And even if it did, computers don't have firing neurons the way that humans do, or even earthworms. Computers operate on this thing called a primary ring, okay? I won't go into the construction of the chips, but there's this thing called the RZ, or ring 0. You'll see it expressed as R0 sometimes. And there's this primary ring where they shove the instructions into this area within the chip, and it is right at that spot within this 0 ring, the primary activation point, that this instruction set, this one little tiny bit of a much larger line of computer code, is actually executed. Okay, so it's executed right at that spot. That's the only part of a computer ever that fires off. Everything else is just merely shoving instructions from, this is the only part that ever is actually activated, and basically it probably spends 99% of its time managing or RAM, shoving stuff around in memory, putting out new pointers to various areas of RAM where it's building up the next screen, and all of this kind of stuff. But when it's doing, for instance, when it's moving something into RAM, it has no concept of what that RAM is representing out here on the screen itself. It has no concept of the contents of that RAM. All it understands is a particular hexadecimal address to this mythical area in a construct in software that is a takeoff of a hardware manufacturer's implementation of it. So it's just these basic little areas that are hot or not in the particular area of RAM. But these little areas here are in no way connected to that. They're not. It doesn't know if these things change. So there's no interconnection between anything. So even if you bought into the idea, even if you could prove that humans were conscious because they had 10 billion neurons firing off within their brains, and truly that kind of stuff happens. Billions of neurons fire continuously. Just listening to me, we're firing off all kinds of billions of neurons in your brain, all simultaneously, and you're making sense out of it all because of the nature of our experience, which is not serial processing the way these serial bus computers work. And even parallel processing computers still have this inbuilt limitation that we're discussing right here. So, but basically, there is no there. You don't have any self for artificial intelligence to become aware of. And self is not created by the sheer number of neurons you have firing off. People that egregiously misuse this really irritate me, and that one of them at the worst level is Kerry Cassidy. Another one is Sean David Morton. I like them both at different levels, but they really are quite irritating when they say that artificial intelligence can exist, that you can have a computer that is aware of self, because self, which we can get into later, is something that is entirely separate from us as humans and exist independent of the number of neurons that we have firing off in our brains. Thus, whether you have a destroyed brain, you're still going to have self-awareness, you're still going to have perception of self, or you can have a really sharp brain, just firing off on all kinds of cocaine or whatever, and you'll still have self-awareness. And to a certain extent, it'll probably feel the same. The self component of this does not exist within artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence as a computing concept merely is taking its power, its ability to create an artificial intelligence from the fact that our stupid minds only operate at 30 to 60 frames a minute, and you can get that primary ring 0 in there to be firing off in, again, hundreds and hundreds of millions of calculations per second. And so thus it can move so much faster than our sensory apparatus can provide inputs that it would appear to us to be mimicking intelligence, but it would have no awareness, have no concept of anything. And then there's one other thing that, again, really irritates me about this. You have the computer over here with all of its hardware and crap, but the AI component of this is software. Software, lines of code written by idiots like myself. And these lines of code are executed first at one level in your primary language as a whole line of code, separated in something, a hard stop some way. But these are actually compiled into who knows how many sections based on the number of instruction sets you have in there. So these lines of code represent the perception, the expression of that software to you. So if I don't put it in that software, that computer can't do it. It can't learn shit. It cannot mimic behavior, or it can't learn behavior. It can't internalize behavior. It can't grow its awareness. It can't grow anything. It can add stuff to a database through auxiliary inputs that then in turn add a base of knowledge for a line of code to extract stuff from that can grow. But it's not growing. It's not mental. It doesn't have any mentition. And if it isn't in this instruction set, it won't be done. And the computer, the software that runs on that computer that make you think of it as an entity, can't alter its own code. So I mean, it doesn't work. So sorry Kerry, sorry Sean, you're just full of crap on that. Absolutely full of crap. You can't have that. You can't have a self-aware computer. Now, let's see. We've got a couple of other quick things to deal with here. Oh, this is a good one. I like this one. So here we have scientists, and they've got this guy who's got his head here, and he's a smart guy, and he's very rich. Let's say he's like what's that guy that runs Oracle? I can't think of his name. Ellison. But anyway, this is Rich Dude A. Okay. And so Rich Dude A, his body is sick, and it's aging and it's dying. So Rich Dude A, he thinks to himself, because Ellison and the guy at Oracle and all these other transhumanists and live forever idiots who just, again, they want to live forever because they don't quite grasp what's going on. No one's told them the basic part of reality here and how and what humans are. And so they've got this really sick idea of what's going on. And so he's got money. And what he wants to do is he's got a guy, and we'll call him Poor Bastard B over here. And Poor Bastard B, he's sad because he's dying, okay? But he's dying of something in his head, and his body's okay. You know, got a skookum body. He's been working out. He's got some shoulders on him. And, he's kind of beefy. He's doing all right. But his head's sick. He's got cancer or something. He's dying. So this guy right here, he talks to a guy we'll call D-R-A, S-S-H-O-L-E, who says, wow, we'll just chop off your head and erase the head of Poor Bastard and move your head over here. And we have you here, smiling up a storm because Poor Bastard is gone. You've got his body. Your body is gone, but you've still got your head and your money. Except, Dr. Asshole, he's going to take a big chunk of that money. He's going to take a huge ass chunk of that money to do this head transplant. All right. Now, here's the real kicker on that. That might work. Let's say that it worked. Let's say you could transplant heads. It's like, sorry there, rich guy A. It turns out the center of awareness for the human self, the identity of the human, their sense of I-ness, selfness, me-ness, separateness that is distinct from all other humans, is actually housed down here in the adrenals, in the adrenal complex near the kidneys. It's something that the Chinese have known forever, and in all kinds of old civilizations have known forever. That the center of consciousness is not up here where we keep our sensory apparatus. It's not where we keep our brain. Our brain is nothing more than a radio receiver. It doesn't keep our memories or any of that kind of shit. It's part of this continuous destruction and recreation 42 trillion times a second anyway. So basically what's going on here is that rich guy A would give this fellow's self down here, which is where consciousness, self B, and here we would have self A. Self A dies. He's on to his hells and heavens. But self B here, he'd get a new face and a shitload of money, whatever Dr. Asshole hadn't taken. So anyway, I can't wait to see this one pop out and then have the guy who was Poor Bastard B, come up and say, nope, I'm not the rich guy. I'm the guy who had the brain cancer. Anyway, so there's that. And then one last thing, and we're done. Just because some people have asked, I'll tell you how it sort of works, and we can get into the detail later. Because our lives around here, like I said at the beginning of this, have evolved or devolved lately into a flying shitstorm activity all the time. So let's look at reincarnation real quick. It would make no sense if you simply reincarnated, if you were existent, and then you died, and then you existed again, and then you died, and you existed again, and then you died. It is because no matter what anybody ever may claim, you have no memory, no sense memory of the time of a previous life. Okay? You do not remember any of the sensory inputs that you ever received in any of these previous lives. You've had millions of them, and you don't remember any of them, which is the only way you can function within the Matterium, and I can go into that some other time too. Okay, so it does not make sense for that view of reality for you to reincarnate each and every time without these sense memories, but you could not reincarnate with them because you'd be constantly frozen because of all the memories and everything going on. You wouldn't be able to absorb it. You wouldn't be able to interpret the Matterium properly. So here's what happens in a more graphic sense, okay? And this is why this explains some other things as well. So you're born and you die. When you're born the next time, in the process of death, what happens is that the sense memories are extracted and they're boiled down into this thick, syrupy mass, and you're left with one single, on your first life, one single element that carried over into the next life. So when you were born the next time, it looked a little bit like that, if we can perceive that, if we can see it. It's a little circle with a dot in it. And as over time, and this right here, this distillation of all of your sense memories from this life, you will take into your next life as intuition in that next life. The ability to make decisions accurately, quickly, without thinking, without attachment to that thinking, as a result of some unknown capability within you that is nonetheless quite valid, evidentiary, perceptible, manageable, usable, practical, and pragmatic. And that exists, that intuition is what we bring over from these previous lives. So the older your soul is, the more intuition you have, the more of an intuitive you are, because you've progressed more, you've had more of these experiences. Now, this is not good, guys. Each time you keep coming back means you've screwed up somewhere. You got shit you're trying to balance. So, we got to get through this stuff. You got to balance more each time in your lives and accelerate it up. But basically, here's a graphic way of understanding the overall continuous progression. And that is, if we looked at our lives that way, we would then see that each and every one of our lives brings within it a form of that same chart of how the universe grows over time, in that our experience would be larger each and every time, because we would be bringing in intuition within each and every one of these bubbles over time as we grow in this continually enlarging progression. And each one of these layers that is our current life has all of our sensory inputs, and has at the same time that we're receiving those sensory inputs, each and every time that they are received, they have a repeating chain that goes back to the intuition that has come from all of the previous lives. And so you get better over time. You get better life after life after life after life. Life is struggle, life is pain, life is hell in many ways. And then you die and then you repeat it. Then you actually live through the hell part of it. But it has a point. And that point is this continuous progression of yourself and your I-ness, your uniqueness, into a greater and greater being as you go forward, adding each and every one of these layers of intuition from the lives before. It seems stupid on the face of it as a mechanism within any given life, because each life is so short, et cetera, and there's all these objections to all of this. But it is, if I ever had the chance to explain it, yet once again, an internalization and an expansion of the complexity of the pulse and the pause and the duality that is the void, non-void of life. And if you take that at all these different levels, the complexity keeps growing and growing and growing and growing, and the Matterium, along with the Matterium, and along with humans. And so human consciousness grows with each and every human that lives and dies, and adds to that. Every time you live and die, you add to that overall human sum total of all knowledge that we think of, that is universe. And then you add to your own internal level as well, and you bring that intuition along with you on your next life. It's really cool. So you're part of the overall experience of universe repeatedly, and it is a self-referential experience of universe, because the intuition you bring from your previous lives are basically connecting and tying you back into what you might want to think of as the Akashic record, which was your sensory inputs from the previous lives that others in a different kind of a fashion are also able to access. So anyway, it's really cool. It's really complex. Universe keeps getting more and more complex as we go along, because the pulse keeps going, and every time it hits a nexus, the next time it hits it, it makes that nexus that much more complex, and so on and so on and so on. But you can see also, by the way, that this particular view of universe and the little bloop and everything precludes the idea of time travel. We don't exist as a material thing that can be shoved into any other time, because time doesn't exist separate from the molecules around which it's or within which it's created. It works across the universe, and you can travel independent of it. So I'm not denying, if I had a technological means of disturbing the energetic pulse here on Earth, I could take a pattern of myself and then recreate it on Mars. At the next time that pulse created me, it would recreate me on Mars. And so I could be there instantaneously, because I would have traveled outside of time. If you want to think of it that way, you're sort of like slipping in the void, in between these things in the void. It doesn't really happen that way, but basically you could theoretically do that, should you have the ability to manipulate energy at that level. And it would be probably hugely cool. Love to get hold of some of that, but I don't have any of that. And it also means that the time travel that all these people are trying to say exist, and time travelers and all of that sort of thing, I don't really think so. There's no evidence of that. And there's this outside thinking on this whole little bloop theory that would promulgate the idea of taking your template, that is to say that your soul, the ability to recreate your body 22 trillion times a second and have it disappear 22 trillion times a second and recreate itself moving. That's what allows movement in universe, by the way, is this segmented thinking and how everything works just like the movies do. And there's the theoretical thinking. You could take your template, if you could figure out a way to do it, and move your soul in connection with time. But the complexity factor denies that. So it has to do with how complex the pulse was at a previous time. You can see that if the pulse is continuously circling back and forth through universe, smashing into itself, it was less complex the last time it went through, and less complex the time before, and less complex the time before, and so on. So the complexity factor in the 1800s of the pulse was nowhere near what the complexity factor is now. And thus, if you tried to, as Marty McFly was, shove himself and his car back into the 1800s, theoretically, had it been able to be done with the energy and so on, it would have blown the 1800s and destroyed the universe at that point, because the pulse would not have been able, theoretically, even though it is self-correcting, the Matterium would not have been able to recreate the pulse and to reconcile the complexity factor the way it's presented in current understandings in the Einsteinian concept of how time travel would occur. And there's loopholes in the little bloop theory that would allow you to do consciousness awareness travel within time, but not remote viewing. That doesn't work either. Remote viewing through time doesn't function. Again, because of the level of complexity and so on. But there are ways to tap into consciousness at various points within the whole time stream, as we think of it as stream. Anyway, that's it, guys. I'm tired. It's been nearly an hour. Hope the hell I can get this thing uploaded to YouTube without destroying it. And that'll be it for a while in terms of these videos. Thanks.